Welcome to episode 115 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Recently, I have had several guests on Anchored in Education who have written fictional literature. Even though most of the works of fiction have been geared towards children and young adults, I have not hesitated to feature these guests. I have several reasons for this, with one of those reasons being that sometimes we need to escape from our adult literature and be reminded that lessons come in many different varieties. The second is that we often don't realize the various things students are going through because we struggle to connect or understand. Today's guest recently published the book Might As Well Be Dead. It is a book that follows a main character who is 13 and trying to navigate the trials of middle school, best friend problems, and even a budding romance. On top of that, he's trying to get over his mom's sudden decision to pick up and leave the family. In the process, he begins having hallucinations of a middle-aged Englishman who ultimately confesses he needs the young protagonist to deliver a message. This book is filled with so much that can cause one to step back to reconsider what unknown trials a person may face. And we welcome author Mark Goldblatt to discuss it more in detail. Mark, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you. I'm excited to talk about this book. But before we do that, and before we get started in today, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Oh, well, I just retired after teaching college English and religious history for 40 years.
Wow. Well, congratulations first, right?
You.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was time to let younger faculty slide into those positions. But I can't say that that being a college professor was something I grew up dreaming about. I wanted to be a professional baseball player, but a profound lack of talent and fear of getting beaned, kept me from that.
Yeah.
And I fell into education really just by accident. I think my fallback position from becoming a professional baseball player was to become a Nobel Prize winning novelist.
Okay.
And that seemed to me to be, an easier career path than baseball.
Sure.
When you're young and arrogant, you think in these terms. So I did take a creative writing class when I was a college freshman. And the teacher suggested that I could earn extra money by tutoring.
Okay.
And tutoring English. And so I began tutoring. And what I found as I started to tutor was that, number one, there was a lot about writing that I knew intuitively, but I didn't know how to explain, such as rules of grammar,
Sure.
The way in which you can construct an essay, things of that sort. And I had to kind of learn it on the fly. And I found I just liked it. I liked learning. I liked processing what I had learned. And I liked explaining what I had learned to somebody else who was eager to learn it. And I began as, the reality of the odds of winning a Nobel Prize and earning a living as a novelist dawned on me. I began to see teaching as a viable career. And honestly, I can't imagine how being a professional baseball player or winning a Nobel Prize would have been more rewarding than 40 years of teaching. My union would kill me for saying this, but I would teach for free. I'm not sure I read papers for free, but I really enjoy being in a classroom,
Sure.
interacting with students, just trading ideas with them and telling them stuff that I know. it's telling them stuff I picked up. I just like the act of teaching.
Yeah. Well, and you can. The union doesn't care what you say now because you're retired,
Yeah,
or
that's
maybe
right.
it's the other way around. You don't have
Yeah,
to care what you say because you're retired.
yeah. I don't think they can cut off my pension
Yeah.
at this.
and I would say that if anybody, growing up is going to have two, respectable and lofty goals, becoming a professional baseball player and then becoming a Nobel Prize, both of, hey, I mean, I'm all about
Yeah,
those.
you got to shoot for the moon, even if you only get about 10 feet in the air.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's still time for the Nobel Prize, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
so
look, I've got my cell phone right here in case the committee calls.
sure. So today we're talking about your new book, Might As Well Be Dead, which it uses some wonderful imaginary literature to help guide the story. What I want to know is what inspired you to revolve the storyline around John Lennon, the Beatles, and how do you believe utilizing a strategy such as this can help convey and cope with childhood trauma?
The concept of the book really came to me after I saw the movie yesterday,
Yeah.
which was I believe 2019 movie,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a fantasy about what would the world be like if the Beatles never existed. But even before that, I had two separate ideas for two books. And I should say that some of my novels have been for young readers. Some of my novels have been for adult readers. And I was thinking about a novel for young readers involving mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about a novel for adult readers involving some fantasy that would allow me to recreate the voice of John Lennon, just because it seemed like an enjoyable thing. And I'm a big Beatles fan.
Yeah.
And I miss the voice of John Lennon. And those two ideas were for at least a decade sort of backburnered and existing on separate tracks. They came together after I saw that movie, and I guess the governing thought was you would have John Lennon appear in a sort of surrealistic way,
Mm-hmm.
as a manifestation of a psychological disturbance in a child. But what intrigued me about writing it in this particular way was having the child who's undergoing this psychological trauma as the narrator. So he's the classic unreliable narrator. You don't know what he's saying is absolutely true,
Sure.
might be true, clearly can't be true. And I've always been a fan of magical realism, and I've never tried to write that sort of book. That was the adult angle for it. And as I was writing the book, I was thinking, I like writing this book. It may be a little much for young middle grade readers, but I think older middle grade readers and certainly young adult readers can handle it. And it got me in touch with John Lennon. And I just liked spending time in his company.
Absolutely. Well, and also, you didn't have in that category the older adult readers, but I'd like to throw myself in there. A very enjoyable book. Couple things to unpack from what you just said. First of all, I'm curious. You mentioned the movie yesterday.
Yeah.
As a Beatles fan, did you enjoy that movie? Because there's a great debate on on that movie, and I personally enjoyed it. My wife will not watch it, and she's the bigger Beatles fan. So I'm just kind of curious where you stand.
I think your response to the movie yesterday is contingent on your ability to tolerate logical holes.
Yeah.
There are logical holes in that plot that you could drive like a truck through.
Yeah, sure.
Where it just doesn't work. But there's the music, and there's also the expressions on the other actors' faces as they're hearing Beatles songs for the first time or acting as if they're hearing Beatles songs for the first time. That's just ingratiating.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't call it a great movie, but there are moments in it that are just, to my mind, transcendent. In particular, there's the moment where Ed Sheeran, who plays himself in the
Yeah.
movie, suggests a competition with the protagonist, whose name escapes me off the top of my head. And Ed Sheeran goes in one corner and writes a song, and the protagonist goes in another corner and writes a song. And Ed Sheeran comes out and plays his song first, and it's a pleasant song. And you are listening to this and thinking, that's really nice. And then the protagonist plays the first chords of The Long and Winding Road on the piano. And The Long and Winding Road wouldn't have even made my list of top 25 Beatles songs.
Right.
But that moment, you just feel as if there may be something to Plato's theory of a world of forms, because it feels like you're going to dissolve into that world because of the recognition that your soul is having as he's striking those chords. And I probably watched that movie at least 5 times through. And I can certainly appreciate that it's not a great movie, but it's a pleasurable movie.
Yeah, and to me, it allowed me the opportunity to at least, I guess, fantasize a world in which I got to imagine what Beatlemania was like. And
Yeah.
because they recreated that essentially in that everybody's hearing these again for the first time. And so
Yeah.
I enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy the movie. I also recognize the plot holes and that it wasn't, it's not probably going to be canonized anytime soon. But
No, I don't see it. I don't see it rising to that level. And I am just old enough to remember Beatlemania. I was 6 when the Beatles first appeared on Ed Sullivan.
Okay.
And I don't have a clear memory of that day, but my mother loved to tell the story of what happened in our household that day, because we had one TV. It was in this monstrously big cabinet. And the only show that we watched together, my sister and I and my mother and father, was the Ed Sullivan Show. Generally speaking, my sister was younger, we'd fall asleep like 15, 20 minutes in, and our parents would have to carry us to the bedroom. But that night, as my mother used to tell the story, as soon as Ed Sullivan came out and the audience started to scream, my sister and I charged the TV and were up on our haunches, pressed within a foot of the screen. And we were riveted to the show. We stayed up through the entire thing. My mother couldn't put us to bed afterwards. And then at midnight, she got up because she heard this banging on the walls. And what it was my sister and I jumping up and down on our beds, hitting the walls. And the earliest incarnation of Beatlemania, and maybe the youngest incarnation of Beatlemania. We didn't even know the words to the songs. We were just making vaguely Beatle-like noises.
Yeah.
And so I do have a memory of Beatlemania.
Well, and I've had the opportunity to see Paul McCartney in concert several times. Of course, just as recent as a Beatle, but I still kind of get to experience it as I see, grown people, weeping at the sight of him driving by. So, I mean, absolutely, you can see, and I apologize for the digression. But
that's okay.
Had to go into a little bit. Now, the other thing that you said, you talked about, you kind of had an idea for the young children, or the juvenile children, if you will, and then adults. So, in looking at writing for both audiences, is there one that is easier than the other? Do they both present challenges within themselves? What do you find as an author to
Yeah.
be kind of that sweet spot?
Well, honestly, I never intended to write a book for young readers. Um, I've written two before this one called Twerp and another called Finding the Worm, were very successful.
Yeah,
They were signed in schools everywhere and paid my rent for many years. And
sure.
the but the truth of the matter is, when I was writing the first of them, Twerp, I had never even heard the term middle grade novel. I was sitting around having lunch thinking with a writer friend of mine, and I was telling him about this book I was writing about a 12-year-old boy trying to portray the moment when his conscience kicks in,
Mm,
when he begins to understand the difference between doing right because it's right and not doing wrong because you're going to get punished. I wanted to sort of capture that moment where that he makes that psychological transition. And as my writer friend, who was way more wise in the ways of the publishing world than I was listening to it, he said, "Oh, you're writing a middle grade novel." He said, "I am not writing a middle grade novel. I'm an adult. I write adult novels." And he said, "Look, if you got a 12-year-old protagonist and he's the narrator, you're writing a middle grade novel."
right.
So from that moment on, he sort of connected me to the pipeline to publish middle grade fiction. Random House picked it up. They were insistent on the title. I had a very different title, something that was more pitched to adults.
Hmm.
But they also didn't make me change anything.
Oh, well, that's nice.
They took the book as is. They didn't make me alter the content at all for a middle grade audience. And so my philosophy of writing middle grade novels has just been write a novel as you would write it. And if the characters are young, that's the way it will be marketed.
Sure.
So
Okay.
Twerp and Finding the Worm were marketed to kids. I was more conscious with this one that it was going to be a middle grade novel, but it didn't affect the writing. I was thinking, I'm writing this because I like the characters, because I like the story, and because I'm interested in the outcome.
Yeah, sure. And let's, that's a great segue to get back into Might As Well Be Dead. So the main character in this story is David. He's a 13-year-old boy. He's struggling with his mom's decision to leave the family. And
Yeah.
David doesn't know a lot about the Beatles, but his mom was a huge Beatles fan. So their songs hold a lot of significance in his life as they connect him with his mom and good memories of his childhood.
Yeah.
Clearly the Beatles' music affected your lives, we just talked about. So, I would like for you to share more about their timeless impact, but I'd like to really know your favorite song and why.
Oh, asking me my favorite song.
I know, right?
That would be hard to say. I off the top of my head, I really like the song Nowhere Man.
Yeah.
I really love this song. I Feel Fine. Let It Be, obviously.
Yeah.
Or No One. I Should Have Known Better. It's just, if we'd spend the entire interview with me spitting out titles, if I didn't cut myself off at this point, and Ticket to Ride, I'm going to kick myself for all the ones I didn't mention.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the particular connection to John Lennon here,
Yeah.
and the reason he figures in the psychological struggles that David is having in the book, is that John Lennon was psychologically damaged by his abandonment by his mother when he was young. And it's impossible to think about John Lennon, the man he came to be, for better or worse, because he certainly had some not entirely positive elements to his personality.
Sure.
It's hard to think of him as being the same person if he had had a happy childhood, if his mother hadn't abandoned him and subsequently gotten hit by a car and killed. just as he was reconnecting with her. So Lennon seemed like connect, a good connection to have for David in the course of working through his trauma. I liked their interactions. I liked Lennon's voice. I liked David's sort of grappling with what happened, not quite being able to make sense of why what happened, and also not being able to quite make sense of what's going on in the present, because he's aware that the ghost of John Lennon, who in the novel is just named Winston, which was Lennon's middle name.
Yeah.
He's aware that there is a strong possibility that he may be hallucinating this character, that this character may not exist in real life. He knows that the other people in his life don't see the ghost. So he's smart enough to know that something is not right with this situation, but he's also captivated by it. Mm-hmm. Lennon becomes, the Winston character becomes a sounding board for the problems he's having. And some of those problems are typical middle grade problems. He's having problems communicating with his best friend. He has a new girl in school who's suddenly romantically interested in him, and he doesn't know what to make of that. So he's working through the typical problems, but he's also in the background working through the genuine distress he's feeling at the absence of his mother. Yeah. And that's kind of the underlying tension of the book.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the hallucinations of Winston that David had. So I mean, because we know that David at home, he's in a mess. There's a mess at home, and like you said, he knows that these hallucinations most likely aren't real, but on the other hand, they are very real to him. You know, and like he sees Winston's shadow next to him on the sidewalk, and he can even feel like he can touch him. So how do the lines of reality and imagination get blurred in children who are going through emotionally difficult and stressful times?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is that psychological trauma or mental illness in children comes in a variety of shapes and forms. I tried to be scrupulous as I was writing the book to do the background research, to try to present David's situation in a way that was entertaining, but not diminishing his struggles. I wanted it to be realistic in the sense that there are instances of hallucinations that have all sorts of other sensory, besides visual, other sensory manifestations. And before the book was published, I also showed early drafts to psychological professionals because I really did not want to do anything disrespectful in this field. And the professionals who I showed it to seemed to think that it was reasonable as a creative way to approach this issue. But I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that the primary goal of any novel is to entertain the reader. I didn't want to write a novel that would be depressing. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to write something that would be a chore to get from page to page. I wanted something that would be fun. I wanted something that would be an enjoyable read, even if there is sort of a gut punch at the end, which reveals the full extent of David's trauma. So that was my thinking as I was writing it. I realized that mental illness is a delicate subject, and you want to approach it in a manner that doesn't in any way diminish the suffering that many people, including children, feel when they're undergoing it.
Oh, 100%. And, at the same time, though, I think it's important that, we have books such as this that can address it, that can allow I think our young readers to be able to read something like this and identify with your character, with identifying with David and be like, oh, he shares a lot of the same things that I'm going through. And I think the identification piece and seeing yourself in a book and in a story is so important with what we're putting out for our readers. And you even talked about it a little bit in that in the book, David, he encounters bullying for being different.
Yeah.
The difficult home lives, like you said, managing the boy-girl relationships, loneliness, so on and so forth. So, how do you believe this book could be used by instructors in their curriculum to discuss these important topics?
Well, I'd hope it can be used just to underscore the fact that psychological trauma comes in all shapes and sizes. You don't have to be having something that resembles a nervous breakdown to be undergoing tremendous stress. And sometimes people who seem to be coping, and I think this is especially true with kids, sometimes people who seem to be coping adequately with distress aren't really coping adequately with distress. It's just that their symptoms are more subtle. Their symptoms tend to be means by which they can manage their illness. And in this case, the symptoms of David's illness charm him. They allow him to get through the day. They allow him to shrug off difficulties he's having keeping up in school. They allow him to manage the stresses that he's feeling from other relationships in his life. His home life, as you mentioned, is in a mess. His father is having just as difficult a time, if not more difficult a time than David is, getting past, his wife's abandonment. So I wanted it to be the kind of book where you would read it and think, I know kids like that. I know kids who are in pain but are adept at camouflaging it. And I wanted, other children who read the book to be on the lookout for it. I wanted them to be thinking, I know this, my friend has had a recent difficulty in his life. He may be experiencing something deeper than it appears, and I don't want to make his life any worse by ragging him about it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Mark, before we go,
sure.
There's probably not a person listening right now who has not been affected or dealt with one or more of the topics this book touches on. And, we've been very careful in, walking our way through this book while, still leaving many parts untouched, because you really got to read it to understand it. So the issues that David faces affect those young and old. After somebody finishes cover to cover and they finish the whole book, what do you hope the takeaway reading Might As Well Be Dead is, and especially for those educators?
Well, after they have their cry, which I'm hoping that their takeaway is that fiction has a purpose beyond entertainment. Mm-hmm. Entertainment is job one. I mean, if you're not entertained by the book, then the writer has failed. But fiction is also a window into things that you may not experience firsthand. It's a way to touch our common humanity, and it's a way to invite other people into our own experiences. And I think that's the sort of humanizing aspect of literature, that at its best, and I'm not going to say that this is the best novel ever written, but at its best, literature allows us to sort of touch the souls of other people. And I would hope that's true regardless of the age of the protagonist and regardless of the age of the reader. And if you come away humming Beatles songs, all the better.
Absolutely. And I for somebody that still maybe has the aspirations of a Nobel, why not say it is the best book ever written? And just,
Well, it certainly seemed like the best book ever written while I was writing it.
There you go. The book is Might As Well Be Dead. There will be a link on today's episode page. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
I appreciate the invitation, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Now, you can read more about Mark on today's episode page. Simply head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab at top. Once you're there, you'll also find a link to Mark's social media as well as a link for you to pick up his book. And if you haven't already, as if you don't know what I'm going to say next, please subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you really want me off your back, why don't you like it, comment on it, and share it with a friend while you're there. The back of Might As Well Be Dead says this: it's a story about a boy in crisis. Be ready to laugh. Be ready to cry. Be advised, all you need is love. Mark and I did a good job navigating this conversation without giving the book's story away. Okay, it's probably just me who was on the brink of blabbing all about it. I admire authors such as Mark and previous guests Tracy Badua and an upcoming guest we're going to have, Linda B. Davis, who have all written books tackling some complex issues our young adults are facing. And let me tell you, as adults, we often gloss over these issues, not necessarily as unimportant, but insignificant to the grand scheme of things, which might be true. To us, I can tell you as a father of a 17-year-old and a 12-year-old, things that seem insignificant to me are huge deals to them. Might As Well Be Dead navigates many of these issues, both minor and complex. It is worth the time to check it out and definitely get it added to your offerings in your school or classrooms. Making sure that we are well-rounded and prepared to help students navigate all challenges is one more reason to remain anchored in education.